Welcome back, everyone. By way of announcement, we have asked if the heating could be turned up for the... So by about 5 o'clock, it'll probably be quite warm in here, so that's something to look forward to. So we'll get straight on with this panel on the state of UK-EU relations. The first thing I'd like to say, actually, is congratulations to whoever in the team wrote the blurb for this panel, because it's spot on that UK-EU relations are simultaneously in a state of stability and flux, which we're going to dig into a little bit. If you can put your questions on Slido, it makes life easier. We're going to try and involve the audience as much as possible in this session. So if you can do that and vote for the questions you want me to pose to the panel, that's just quicker, but we will obviously grudgingly take questions from the floor as well using the mics if you'd prefer that. But without further ado, let me introduce the panel. This is going to be weird because I'm going to introduce them without looking at them because I'm aware of the fact that unless we stare at the microphone, then you can't hear what's happening. Catherine Barnard is a professor at the University of Cambridge and a senior fellow UK in a Changing Europe. Hussein Kassim is a professor at the University of Warwick, even though it says East Anglia here, and a senior fellow of UK in a Changing Europe. And then we have two former ambassadors. On my left, Sir Julian King, who was former ambassador of the UK to France and a former EU commissioner. And on my right, João Vale de Almeida, who was the former, eventually, the EU ambassador to the United Kingdom after a few wrangles along the way. And just to kick you off to all of you, I suppose, if you reflect on where we're at now, what is the current state of the UK-EU relationship? We might as well go in the order that I introduced you. So, Catherine.
I think the answer is certainly better than it was under Boris Johnson. Windsor Framework, which we heard about the last session, has clearly made quite a difference. But it's sort of a bit like a relationship with an ex in a divorce. It's not that warm. We're there. It's something of an inconvenience. But there's no real ambition to make things better from the EU side. So, and of course, it's worth remembering that the TCA was a bloomin' good deal from the EU's perspective. They got virtually everything they wanted. And, of course, the status quo is very hard to change. There will be an implementation review at the end of 25, start 26. But it is a review of the implementation. It's not a review of the treaty as a whole. And at the moment, ambition looks pretty limited for that to lead to any significant change.
I'm going to pick you up on something with my newfound patriotism. The EU didn't get everything they wanted, did they? Because EU officials have said subsequent to the negotiations that they wanted something on foreign and security policy.
That's true, but I was thinking more from the trade perspective in the commercial sense of the term, and so EU always had a surplus in respect of trade in goods. We had a surplus in respect of trade in services. EU got a very good deal in respect of goods, and the services provisions in the TCA are frankly woeful. Particularly in respect of mobility of people. They are scarcely more than GATS, the General Agreement on Trade in Services. Now, for a lot of people who were concerned about immigration, that was clearly a good thing. But of course, what we've seen is because the TCA, the Trade and Cooperation Agreement, hasn't delivered, therefore it's been left to domestic policy to deliver, and we've got migration figures which are now significantly higher than they were in 2016.
Loads more Indians, though, which is good. Hussein.
I agree largely with Catherine, and I think that on the EU side, there's a very sort of clear position that nothing much is going to change no matter what the new government looks like, unless there's a shift up the Barnard staircase, which means a withdrawal of the UK red line. So that's a real issue, a force for continued equilibrium, and I would argue a sub-optimal equilibrium. On the UK side, I think that during the negotiations, the debate we had was, to say the least, solipsistic, and I think there's a long way to go for any incoming UK government in explaining where we are, discussing what the implications of the deal that was signed were, and just arguing for a normalisation. Because I agree with Catherine, there has been normalisation under the sort of Sunak administration, but it's a normalisation where quite a lot happens beneath the surface. There's quite a lot which is good, is positive, is constructive, but it's not necessarily reported or discussed very much.
Okay, interesting. I mean, Julian, you can answer my original question, but just based on what Hussein says, one of the things that dawns on me is that the EU doesn't really have a normal relationship with any of its neighbours, does it?
It's true that apart from annexing them, the EU has a certain amount of difficulty in trying to structure its relations with near neighbours. But just to go back to your original question, I think I agree with everything that's just been said, but I just want to note that the UK relationship with the EU isn't the only thing that's going on. It's not the only subject in town in Brussels. They've got quite a lot on their plate at the moment. I was there last night talking to some of them in the margins of the dinner that they were having. And obviously there's a lot going on in the world, as you put in your report, Ukraine, but other Russian activities as well, concerns about China, concerns about the US, etc. But they've got quite a lot of other things directly on their plate, on the internal EU plate as well. They failed to make progress on top jobs last night, or at least get as far as people were perhaps expecting them to get. They've got to come back to that, and it might get more difficult before it gets easier. They've got a lot of things, a lot of moving parts in the European Parliament, which may not be of great interest to many people outside the European Parliament, but it is very important for those people who sit there, and it's an important part of the wider Brussels picture. And they've got some really big challenges in organising and running themselves into the next period. They have done too much regulation. Some of it they're going to have to manage now, both on tech and particularly, and we might come back to this, on the sort of so-called green agenda. And they've undertaken various projects which are going to cost a lot of money, and they haven't got enough money. This was the Geopolitical Commission. There are some of them who are worrying that the next commission might be the one that goes broke.
Interesting. João, can it really be the case that we're not a priority for the European Union?
Not at all, not at all, not at all. Now, listen, one of my purposes this morning is to contradict Anand when he said that EU negotiators are ruthless and cruel and tough and all that. I'm a very nice guy, so I hope I can, be a good example. Listen, if I look at the relations today, and now I speak, of course, only on the personal basis, after having retired from service, but I would say that they are not as cold as this room, but they have the potential to be a lot warmer, sometime soon by 5 p.m. in a few months' time. But for that to happen, I would say three things from the EU side, just to also kick off some discussion. Three constraints, I would say. The first one is the political attention bandwidth, which is crowded, which only has a few slots, and they are narrowing down because of the European and international context. So how do you grab the attention of Europe for the UK file is a big issue and a challenging one. The second one is political trust. I was lucky enough to manage a period of very low trust, the 1,000 days after Brexit. Trust has gone higher, and that's good, but I don't think it is yet at the level where it should be to allow this relationship to really flourish. And I think of short-term trust, which is what the new Prime Minister, whoever he is or she is, he should be a he, right? You never know. But in terms of the short term, the new Prime Minister has to create the basis for a new understanding. But what I'm talking about and more worried about is what I call the long-term trust in the country. I'm coming back after 1 year in the academic world, and I see Mr. Farage is back. And I may even see a former Prime Minister back as well. What does this tell to European capitals about long-term quality relationship? That's a question mark. And the third point is, of course, the attractiveness of the UK package. What's in there for the EU? Even being a nice guy negotiator, I still need to care about the interest on the EU side. So I think we should think carefully about what can both sides put on the plate. And I leave you just with this. If I had to choose 3 priorities for the flourish of this relationship in the future, seen from the EU side, first is security, second is security, and third is security. And by security, I mean lato sense of security, from defense, foreign policy, but also economic security. I leave it to you as a hint for further discussion.
I do like the way you make a year in academia sound like a year in the gulag with no access to news media or.
It was sort of. It was sort
I suppose it was Cambridge, but I mean.
He was with me.
Yeah.
That probably explains it.
a cure.
I mean, just it's a factual question. I don't know if anyone knows the answer to this, but I do wonder: has the EU ever undertaken large-scale negotiations with a partner where the main opposition has made clear its objective of ripping up whatever's agreed?
It's doing so at the moment, I think. Some of the discussions it's having with its near neighbours at the moment probably fall into that category. Georgia, for example.
Yeah. Okay, that makes sense. All right, because I mean, it does seem to me you're quite
It's
right.
the other way around in Georgia. It's the government.
The government. Yeah. We mentioned. I mean, there's a couple of things that came out of what was just said. The first is, I mean, Hussein mentioned the staircase. Haven't we outgrown that staircase now? I mean, in the sense that, if we regain that trust, do we think that the EU could or should be a little bit more creative and a little bit more flexible than Michel Barnier was when he came up with that diagram? Or am I just being hopelessly naive and cherry-picking? Any of you?
I mean, for those of you not familiar with Michel Barnier's staircase, it's a famous PowerPoint slide that he produced, which had all of the different levels of intensity of relationship with single market at the top, and then moving down to a free trade area, which is where the EU always thought we would end up. I mean, because of the red lines that we have imposed. Now, the problem is, from an EU's point of view, that staircase makes a whole lot of sense. But there have been various talks about, is it possible to use the jargon, different forms of concentric circles. And we've already seen, yes, Northern Ireland is a unique situation, but nevertheless the EU was prepared to compromise on its red lines in order to preserve the Good Friday Agreement. So it is possible to see some flexibility. Now the EU would say Northern Ireland should not be held up as a template for other relations, but what you're seeing is, in the front page of the Financial Times yesterday, Rachel Reeves talking about various forms of alignment, and is this looking towards a resurrection of the Chequers deal? I think the answer is no. But the EU has got to think about how it deals with its near neighbours, most importantly Ukraine, where there is a commitment that Ukraine will become a full member by 2030. I'm not sure that most people think that will happen, not least because of the billions of euros that need to be poured into Ukraine. And of course, there's still a war going on the eastern side. So then the question is there a way of accommodating Ukraine with staged membership, and any of those stages, is it possible then to think that other neighbours, not just the UK, but if you look to the south, Morocco, Algeria, and so forth, might be able to be involved? And that requires creative thinking, and that requires time and space. The only person who's showing signs of doing creative thinking on this is Macron, and he's got his own difficulties at the moment. And of course, as Julian just said, there are many other things on the EU's plate at the moment, and reinventing the staircase is probably not one of them.
Anyone else on the staircase? You don't all have to. But
Well, can I just say, I think the staircase was, to a degree, of its time. It obviously spoke to some underlying...
Not a staircase for the ages.
Yeah. Well, it obviously spoke to some underlying principles, which João used to be very eloquent in defending. But it was also of its time. And we're not in 2016 or even 2019-20 now. The world has changed. The EU is changing as well. And I think there is a question about whether it's going to be set in its ways, thinking in the same way as it was then, or whether it's actually under the pressure of events, and not least the need to build, as João's just said, new security partnerships, whether it's actually going to be ready to look at some of these issues afresh.
No, I agree with Catherine and Julian. I think, I'm old enough to remember Led Zeppelin's Stairway to Heaven, so every time people mention Barnard's staircase, I see heaven somewhere, but we are not yet there. Now, if I look more seriously now on what we should focus on, I would start by forgetting the TCA review. And I would try to avoid any kind of reconfiguration of what we have already today. No redecoration of our apartment. Let's keep it as it is, because knowing my system, as many people in this room know, once we make a deal, the last thing we want is to undo the deal, because we are never sure of being able to find another deal. And division is something that the EU wants to avoid at all costs. So any attempt to reconfigure the present agreements, if the red lines do not change on the UK side, is not a very, not a track that I would like to follow. I would prefer us to think in terms of what can we add to what we already have. Not touching upon the withdrawal agreement nor the TCA, beyond their own kind of dynamics, and there are some dynamics inside those agreements that can evolve, but not a fundamental redrafting of that for the reasons I just mentioned. So what could we add to what we already have that addresses some of the points I made? Attract the attention of my leaders, being attractive enough, political and economically, and a number of ideas have been floated. I would focus first and foremost on security, defense, foreign policy. How can we help each other address the challenges that we have, geostrategic and geoeconomic ones? And that involves Ukraine, Russia, as much as it involves China, or even a Trump re-elected president in the United States. But I would raise another issue, which has been in the news in the recent weeks, which is very down to earth, which affects, in my view, those who were the main victims of Brexit, and that is young people. Youth mobility. There is scope there for us to add to what already exists in a way that provides the conditions I mentioned earlier. So these are some issues. I would think of migration as well. If you look at the new political context in Europe, it will be a lot about migration. It will be a lot about anything that brings member states to a position where they can fight back and push back against the far-right pressure on that. And I think in these areas, as much as how do we deal with China, how do we deal with the United States, there's plenty of topics that can attract attention, provide output, without going into, and this is my last point on this, we have to avoid the kind of super cherry picking. That would lead us to the trauma we lived before, that will stop people wanting to talk about EU-UK relations.
I mean, my role in UK and Changing Europe over the last 8 years has been to go to Brussels a lot and speak to people in the institutions and the perm reps, so national officials also. And I would just echo very strongly what João's just said. I mean, there's a general regret about the UK departure, about the state of the relationship, and there is a wish to see cooperation in security and defence areas, but that doesn't mean to say that the treaty negotiations will be opened or there'll be any concessions made on the sort of economic or trade partnership. And I think that position really is stable, solid, and entrenched. And I'd say also that it's not just a sort of a position, as it were, it's institutionalized. the way in which the Council working group on this shares information about its interactions with the UK, its bilateral interactions with the UK, the way that the EU obligations, the EU will overshadow all those bilateral relationships, and there's a sort of cultural ethos that's very evident in Brussels between the member states and the institutions, which is this is a solid position. The single market is what really matters to us, and that matters more to us than the relationship with the UK.
Yeah, interesting. I mean, João's comment on migration just raised the tantalising possibility that we have a complete reversal for the next European Political Community meeting, where we have a Labour Prime Minister hosting who doesn't want to talk about migration, and European leaders turning up desperate to talk about migration, which is exactly the opposite of what happened in Grenada. But let's dig into these things. I mean, firstly, thanks to all of you for voting on questions that isn't the Euro 24 question, because I was tempted to put that one to the panel, and I might yet. But let's dig into these issues a little bit and start with security. I mean, Labour have said they want a security pact. João, you said there's stuff we can do on security. What would a security deal consist of, and would it make much of a difference if we got one? Julian.
So I rejoice in the honour of being the first EU Commissioner for Security, which was sort of before it was fashionable. But it did speak, even then, to a broader sense of what security might mean, which I think has only been reinforced and developed since because of the pressures. So security includes, for the EU, deep defence issues, particularly building defence capability, which has come obviously into the spotlight around Ukraine. It includes wider foreign policy consultations of all sorts, sanctions, other policy instruments. It includes also, as we've been saying, a sort of wide sense of economic security. That includes things like infrastructure, resilience, and energy security. But wider than that, this, again, has come very much into focus because of the relationship with China, but not only. How do you reduce your strategic dependencies and build up different sorts of resilience to resist pressure or coercion, both physical and, as it were, sort of political and moral? So you can have quite a broad sense of economic security. These are EU interests. And in order to pursue them, and indeed, you've also got the borders, the frontiers and migration. These are key EU interests. And in order to pursue them, the EU is looking, one, to reinforce how it works itself, how the member states work together and how the member states work with the institutions. But it is also looking outwards to work out how it can develop and reinforce partnerships with like-minded countries. And that, it seems to me, is potentially an opportunity for the UK to, if it wants to, with the new government, to engage with the EU, exactly in the kind of spirit that João has been setting out, to say, look, the world has changed, there are shared challenges that matter to both of us, both the EU and the UK, and we'll be stronger in facing those if we find new ways of working together. Now, it gets more complicated when you start to dig down into it, as you suggest in some of your material. Developing cooperation on defence, deep defence capability building is complicated because the EU is set up to favour EU businesses and EU capabilities in this field. So balancing that with partnering with others is going to be a bit of a challenge. And on the wider sense of security and economic security, if the UK or any other partner comes along and says, look, we really do want to work with you on securing, for example, access to critical inputs or the resilience of our supply chains, that does get into elements that are relevant to the single market. So I'm not saying this is easy, but I think there's a growing sense on the EU side that they need to think about this, and there's an opportunity, if a new government wants to take it, on the UK side to engage.
So, João, I mean, obviously in a personal capacity, but with your knowledge of how the EU thinks, what could a security deal with a new Labour government contain that will be relatively straightforward to negotiate, do you think?
Well, 2 points there. I think the reason I mentioned security, it goes back to my 3 points. Attention bandwidth, political trust, and attractiveness. And I think we could, and I very much agree with Julian, we could put together a package that would do that. And by that I mean that would tell my leaders this is worth investing in. Secondly, that the UK is serious about it. And thirdly, that there is, products for both sides to benefit from. What it could involve, I think it also means, or should mean, that this is the beginning of the building of trust. If we start by such a noble and such a relevant issue, we're sending a very clear signal that this is important for us. If you start by cherry-picking on the current agreement, you are, waking up ghosts of the past. So what I would like to see is a change of mindset in this relationship, and I think security can do a lot of that. So another element that was not touched upon by, well, only slightly by Julian, is the whole industrial side of things. So we are approaching it, we are basically an economic project, an economic system with a very solid economic dimension. And the way forward that we are, trying to go ahead with this is a very strong industrial / research / competitiveness / efficiency in the defense industry and security wider. So why not, aren't there issues where we can work together? We are facing the same threats, we are facing the same challenges from abroad. There must be room for cooperation, having in mind, of course, all the limits of the internal market dimension and the competition, which is a healthy one between the two sides of the channel. But I still think that given the enormity of the challenges that we are facing today, there is room there, and that would fill all my conditions for success on the EU side.
So, Hussein and Catherine, I'm still no closer to knowing what specifically, let's just say David Lammy turns up in Brussels and says, I want to sign a security pact, let's make a statement of faith, let's get something on paper, get something down, sign it. What would it say? What are the things, what are the low-hanging fruits? What are the things we could agree with without getting into the defense industrial stuff, which is going to take longer, that we could agree and that might make a difference?
Well, there's a lot of cooperation taking place anyway on cybersecurity and counter-terrorism as part of the DCA, so that's kind of a part of the normalisation that we were speaking about earlier. But I mean, there are many, many other areas of potential cooperation. My hesitation about this is less on the EU side. Actually, it's just how does a Labour government summon up the courage and say this is something we're going to do, while a Eurosceptic press, a Eurosceptic Conservative Party are policing the referendum, the post-referendum, and are saying, look, we've seen headlines like this in the Daily Mail over the last couple of weeks. We also saw the article by David Frost and Robert Jenrick saying, Starmer is going to take us back into Europe, and this is against the mandate, the mandate that was issued by that comes from the referendum. And so I'm really hesitant about even if there was a really good offer on the EU side, whether a Labour government could actually would have the courage really to sort of to make the arguments domestically.
But let me just challenge you on that, because I mean it is conceivable, at least looking at the polls, I mean it's quite a stretch for us, our imaginations, but try this, that we're entering a world where we don't need to care what Robert Jenrick says or thinks. I mean, because the Conservative Party is faced with a massive Labour majority that is overwhelmingly pro-closer relations with the European Union. That's a whole different world, isn't it?
It'd be interesting to see if that's a will that comes about. Yeah, sure. But I mean, I'm sort of also noting the hesitancy on the part of the Labour Party figures, and I still think it matters to parts of England what Boris Johnson thinks and says in the Daily Mail. But the point is that there is a strong strand of opinion that is policing whatever a government will do. And this is why I alluded earlier to the fact that the UK, with the normalisation, there's a lot going on beneath the surface that isn't reported. I mean, how many people know that the UK rejoined PESCO, for example? That was done. I'm not going to say very stealthily, but it wasn't something that was
It's not been done.
Well, there's a different issue. There was a Gibraltar issue around that. Yeah. Did you want to come in on this?
I just wanted to say, I mean, if you ask what David Lammy could do on day 2 or day 3, you could have some aspirational text. It wouldn't be legally binding. Now, of course, we know that as far as foreign and security policy, it's largely intergovernmental anyway. The plus would be at least there'd be some framework for discussion, because that really isn't happening still, and I think it's one of the many weaknesses of the operationalisation of the TCA. But then the question is, what next? Because as soon as you get, apart from saying, wouldn't it be nice to work together, you soon get into some very difficult weeds, and working together nicely might involve procurement, and procurement is difficult, particularly in the field of defence. On the other hand, a more positive reading, you could say that given the shopping list that Julian has just provided as to what falls under the broad umbrella of security rather than defence, you could see that this might be a stepping stone to closer relationships in a much broader range of areas. Now, the sensitivity is, of course, that means we're rejoining the EU, but polling shows that actually there would be support for that. I'm not in any way suggesting that's where we're heading. But I mean, there will always be, whichever government's in power, looking over its shoulder, that there's no reneging on Brexit. On the other hand, the evidence shows, both the polling evidence and the economic evidence shows, that Brexit has not delivered all of, or indeed, now say many of the things that the Brexiteers promised. And so we are now in a much more vulnerable world. And therefore there may be some appetite to do something which is much more proximate if it can be couched in terms of making people feel safer.
So we've got lots of Slido questions on this theme. I'm about to come to the audience, incidentally, so if you get your questions ready about the broad area of mobility. I think I'll channel my inner Daily Mail in asking this question and say, why is the European Commission so keen to stop member states allowing their young people to come over here? I mean, why can't we sign individual deals with
That's
member
really
states?
a Daily Mail question.
I know, I'm quite proud of that.
You're an expert on that. I mean, we didn't start this game, right? No, I think the commitment I see in Brussels and in capitals is to make it work. And you can only make it work if it is at community level, right? It's very difficult to make, dozen bilateral agreements on mobility work properly. So we thought, I think my former colleagues thought that it was a good idea to put forward some proposals on that. I told you earlier from my experience here and in Europe, young people are the main victims of Brexit. I mean, we have taken away from a whole generation of people chances that we had, my children had, and maybe my grandchildren will not have, of sharing a lot with Brits, with British young people, and vice versa. And we took this away from them for no obvious reason. So we believe there is a case and there is room for understanding. We believe it should be EU-UK level and not a bilateral one, and that's why we put forward this idea. I know it fell into the wrong political context, but I think it's worth resurrecting it, because the potential for goodwill, the potential for electoral support is in my view obvious. So if you combine more harder files like security and defense and all that with softer ones that are really relevant for real people, I think we could add a few others. I'm open, intellectually open to ideas around migration or even SPS. I think what we need is a critical mass of goodwill, political engagement to start a new cycle. And that's what I would, if I had any responsibility, advise people to do, is to, start on a clean slate, project new ideas, have a new agenda, build trust on that. And on that basis, our systems will start working better together, or the whole machinery of the TCA, the whole machinery of the withdrawal agreement would more likely than not produce positive results.
Catherine.
On youth mobility, you'll recall João was just mentioning that the Commission put forward a proposal to propose that the Council give it permission to start negotiating on this. It was a fairly ambitious, the content of the measure was ambitious, but crucially it was not about free movement, which is what it was promptly billed as by certain of the papers, because it didn't have a settlement dimension. You could go for up to 4 years and then that was it. You had to return to your home country. Why did the EU do it then? I mean, there's various possible explanations, but I think most importantly they were getting worried that the UK was getting closer to doing some sort of deal, bilateral deal with Spain, France, those countries where UK nationals most want to go. And they've always said we speak as one from the EU's point of view, and the fact is that the UK was showing no interest in doing a similar mobility deal with Romania and Bulgaria, and therefore the EU wanted to put a stop to that. So, and
we did sign a deal with the French, didn't we? On school trips.
On school trips, but nowhere near as ambitious as what was being proposed. And if you read that document, the repeated references to the fact that the EU sings as one really tends to reinforce the point that they didn't want the UK cherry picking with favoured nations.
I confess I stopped at the bit that implied EU students would pay domestic fees at universities. I gave up reading at that point. Horror.
Well, because you're not a proper lawyer, and therefore you should read to the end of a document.
I'm not a lawyer at all.
Well, I know that.
The fine print.
Julian, did you want to come in on this at all? Okay, let's turn to...
Yeah, I mean, I think this is it's a really brilliant example because it shows so many different things about how the misunderstandings here about how the EU works, about the demonisation of the Commission and the Commission as a power grabber. Because, I mean, actually, from what I understand from speaking to a number of member states, what happened is that they suddenly, first of all, there's a suspicion of the UK because of the divide and rule strategy during the negotiations. So member states are continually talking to each other whenever they get contact. That's not something that the Commission imposes. Council regulation adopted as on the conclusion of the withdrawal agreement, and then one with the TCA. So it's kind of normal. And my understanding of what happened is the member states that weren't included just said, well, why aren't we included? This is really very suspicious. That's when the Commission stepped in and said, let's do this. The other thing about youth mobility, as Katherine quite rightly says, I mean, it's different from freedom of movement, and that's something that wasn't really explained. And this is also something that makes me sort of worried and hesitant about domestic politics in the UK. Is that the EU are very they feel that lots of things were offered during the negotiations that the UK refused then, and why should it offer now? Unless there is a strong sort of reciprocal interest.
Okay, I mean, I'm still a bit confused because it seems like the argument is we're absolutely united, so we're going to do something collectively to prevent people doing things by themselves.
No.
No.
It's to the benefit of everybody.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
It's very democratic.
Okay, I'm going to give up now and turn to the audience. Any questions for our panel from the... Anyone near Mirren at the back who's holding the mic so she doesn't have to do her usual cross-country? Oh.
Thank you. I'll try my question again. Maybe I'll try to rephrase it. Okay, the headline, the state of UK-EU relations, but when the people on the panel have lots and lots of experience in the broadest possible areas, I don't understand why we keep talking about the EU as if it was, I don't know, Poland or Iceland or something. The EU is a political and a geographic area, but it is governed, run and organised by a number of bodies. So when you talk about the EU, I suppose my question is, are you talking about the Commission? Are you talking about the European Council? Are you talking about the European Parliament? In none of those do we, tragically, have a foot at the moment, but I guess there are ways in which there are representatives of the UK that can talk to those different bodies. And I'm just interested as to what you think we mean by EU and what you think the British public thinks about it.
Okay, thank you. This might be a role for a lawyer.
There is a marvellous legal answer to that, which will turn absolutely everybody off. That it does. The EU is a legal entity and thus can speak as one and negotiate, for example, international agreements. But you're absolutely right that often the EU becomes synonymous with the Commission because probably Ursula von der Leyen is the most visible representative. Most people aren't that au fait with the difference between the various institutions. They haven't read any of Hussein's books, which make all of this abundantly clear. But the fact is that when we're talking about the EU's view on the UK's relations, yes, of course, there's lots of sub-views within that, but the bottom line is it is the Commission and, it must be said, the European Council, which probably represents the collective EU view. I don't know if you want to add to that.
No, I agree with them. Yeah.
Either of you two want to come in on that?
No, the lawyer has said it all.
Okay, perfect.
That's it.
I think the gentleman who has the mic.
If there were more lawyers in the world would be a better place.
You heard it here first. And last.
Yeah, thank you all very much. Ewan Grant, United Kingdom Defence Forum. The books I held up on camera in my TV and radio broadcast on the Ukraine war, including before the 24th of February, were precisely the same books I put on the table in front of staff in the EU delegation in Kyiv in April 2014 and said, I think you need to read these books carefully. My question is on the issue of security in its widest sense, and with the hugely thoughtful comments we've heard from you. Are there any particular opportunities for quick wins in cooperation, not just with the UK, but also Trump-proofing relations with America, which don't tread on the difficult procurement issues? Two things I would suggest might really be high up that is embedding Five Eyes people seriously in the new EU anti-money laundering authority and working with EU Frontex, where of course the new head is trying to clear up the thundering disgrace which was the disaster of the previous French head of Frontex. Thank you.
Security Commissioner.
I'm happy to have a go at that. None of the things I'm about to say is entirely straightforward. If they were entirely straightforward, then possibly they might have already happened, even in the current circumstances. But if, against the kind of background that we've been discussing, there was to be, from both sides, both from the UK and from the EU, a sort of, not a fresh start, but a look at the reality of the current challenges and whether there could be areas that you might work on, then I think there are some things that might open up reasonably quickly as, I don't want to call them early wins, but sort of tokens of a new approach to trying to work together in these areas where actually some of the more difficult issues will take quite a long time to work through. But more quickly, on the defence side, the UK could choose to get involved in some of the smaller civilian military operations that the EU runs and sponsors around the world. It's done that in the past. It could start a discussion to have an arrangement with something called the European Defence Agency, that's a kind of clearinghouse and body for thinking about how you develop European-wide defence capabilities. It's not the same as agreeing exactly how you're going to do that, but you can start the discussion. The United States has that kind of relationship, so, you know, if it's good enough for them, presumably the UK could have that kind of relationship. There's a lot of support to Ukraine, practical support to Ukraine, in the defence field. A chunk of it's collectively organised through the EU. A chunk of it is what you might call off-balance sheet. So it doesn't raise questions about how the UK is getting embroiled in the EU budget and things like that. There's lots of practical things, training, armament supplies, increasingly other sorts of support to Ukraine that could be, and it sounds like you've looked at some of this, could be in scope without triggering wider discussions about re-engagement in the mechanics of the EU. On internal security, there's a whole host of agencies that the UK, in fact, has some kind of relationship with under the TCA, but could have a much closer and I would say mutually beneficial relationship. There's a police agency called Europol, there's a justice agency called Eurojust, there's the border agency called Frontex. There's all sorts of extra things that the UK could do with those agencies if it wanted to. And then on the economic security issues, I think quite close to the top of the list, there's energy security. Both the UK and the EU are doing things on carbon border mechanisms. Are they going to do those together or separately? How's that work? There's a lot of shared infrastructure, particularly around offshore wind. How are you going to make that work better together? And then you could look at some of the issues that we've touched on already about better securing access to critical inputs and critical supply chains. Now that, I recognise, does start to get a little bit more difficult, but the EU is negotiating arrangements with other third countries at the moment on access to various sorts of critical minerals. Why can't the UK get engaged in that sort of thing? So I think there's quite a large range of issues where you could start to do some things, some of them small, some of them a bit more significant, quite quickly. And that might be a token of this new approach and give you time to do the deeper and more difficult issues, both on defence and wider economic security.
Sure.
Just 2 points to complete a very good outline by Julian. First, that we started working on this during the negotiations. You remember that the EU proposed a defence, foreign policy, security protocol agreement, whatever, which was rejected. So there was some work already done previously on our side. The other point is cybersecurity and artificial intelligence and what comes down the road, and God knows the difficulties that this will imply in terms of security. So without any dynamic alignment of regulation, but certainly regulatory cooperation seen from the angle of security is certainly a priority for both of us.
Let me just ask a quick follow-up for any one of you, which is, it does seem to me that one of the things that Labour are doing is trying to use the word security, so everything has a security prefix, as a possible way of sort of wriggling around some of the tricky legal things. Oh, well, this is a security issue, so it should be treated differently or specially or quicker. My sense to date is that that will get absolutely no resonance in Brussels, where it's pretty much, we're not circumventing our rules because you call something security. But I don't know if any of you have got any thoughts on this. It does seem to be a tactic that Labour are adopting.
So I was trying to be quite concrete in some of the examples I was just giving.
Yeah.
I don't think any of the examples I've just given fall foul of what you've just said.
Right.
But how you present this, obviously, is crucial.
Yeah.
There's quite a lot of history here. On a number of occasions, sometimes I think unfairly, but nevertheless, on a number of occasions, within Europe, including when the UK was still a member of the EU, it's been felt that the UK was trying to trade off security cooperation for other sorts of benefits. And I think that you'd have to find a way of doing what we've been talking about that didn't fall into that trap, because otherwise you will get the kind of resistance that you're talking about.
Okay.
The beauty of this file, just to conclude on this, because it's The beauty of this file is that we are under such a pressure, both of us, on the security and defense and geostrategic side, that there is slightly more room for some degree of ambiguity.
Okay. Are there any questions at that side? There's Mary right back there who's had a hand up for ages and ages.
This fellow's got a microphone.
Oh, someone's got the mic. Okay. Yeah. I tell you what, Mary,
hello.
you just do it and leave me out of this because I'm rubbish.
Yeah, my name is Dr. Shiva, and I'm a banker and economist for 30 years, and I work for AIB Bank, and now I'm working with Nomura Research. This is the headline by Bloomberg. Brexit is costing 100 billion per annum. And also, there is an acute shortage of staff, and also the business investment in UK is weaker. This is the Bloomberg report. So we were in one large block, and we had all the opportunity. Now we come out of the block now, all this cherry picking thing, it sounds like child play. Of course, we are doing one large project, human brain project, UK and Munich. So like that way, individual projects like security also, it's all like small thing, but are we able to get the bigger thing, like, the visas? You can see in St. Pancras, how much queue even to just cross the tunnel. So these are the questions that it's very important.
So I suppose, just to paraphrase, I suppose the question is, are we just talking about tinkering around the edges here, or the elephants in the room are the real things blocking contact? I don't know if anyone, the answer seems to be yes, in my opinion, but...
I think the answer is yes, unless the situation changes. Now, again, views are divided about the effect of if there is a Trump government in the United States, whether that will provide some pressure to accelerate relations, but others say, given that's already been factored in, it won't make that much difference. I think João's got some views on that.
Catherine thinks you've got some views, João.
No, I think we need to be, this relationship deserves creativity, but it also deserves and requires honesty and realism. It's the balance of these two qualities that will produce some good results. And that's, as a firm believer in this relationship, that's what I wanted to see in the coming, whoever wins the elections here, with a new cycle in Europe. And by the way, we were a bit unlucky because your decision to hold elections on the 4th of July is a bit too early for our cycle. From that point of view, it would have been better November than July. But on the short term, I think, and this is a real issue because the way things start determine a lot the success, the future success. So we need to organize ourselves in a way between now and December to start on the right footing. And that's why July elections here is a bit more complicated. But to come down to your point, I believe both sides should show creativity. We should invest in new ways of doing things, but in full honesty. Friends have to talk straight, right? And we need to say, this is not possible. Don't go there because you are waking ghosts of the past. Let's try new areas where we can produce a clean agenda. This is, I think, where we should focus ourselves.
Mary in the white jacket has had a hand up for about a week.
Notoriety precedes me. Mary Duszewski, journalist. I'd like to go back to the two questions which have really dominated this discussion. One of them on what we're calling youth freedom of movement, because you talked about maybe resurrecting that. But Labour was almost as quick to reject the proposition as the Conservatives were. So I wonder whether you see that just as a campaign issue and something that can be resurrected, or whether it's actually not realistic. On security, I've just been travelling in the northeastern part of Europe, and I'm not sure that security is quite as simple as it seems, because it looks to me as though there is a potential risk that any sort of potential security agreements between the UK and the EU becomes a sort of touchstone for the big division across the EU between what you might broadly call the Atlanticists on the one hand and the people, the strategic autonomy people on the other. And I wonder how you can get around that. Thank you.
Do you want me to say something on youth mobility?
Yeah.
Yes, I mean, I must say I was surprised at the scope of what the Commission was proposing, including touching on the sensitive issue of tuition fees in universities. Wearing my university hat, of course, we have lost very large numbers of EU students, which is to the detriment of high quality education, both for the universities and also for the diversity amongst the pool. In fact, it's the question that's most often raised when I travel, when can EU students have the same fees as domestic students? But as you know, universities are in very severe financial trouble at the moment, and the loss of international fees will be a huge blow for universities. Like you, I noticed that Labour rejected it, the offer within seconds of the Conservatives having done the same. And it was also Rachel Reeves repeated it yesterday in her interview with the Financial Times. It would be possible to envisage a smaller version, but mobility is such a sensitive issue, and while it was clearly a mobility deal and not free movement, it was very easy, because it did allow movement, to be painted as a free movement deal. On the other hand, Labour has got to appeal to a younger cohort, and this would be a relatively cheap way of doing so. And so it may be that they have a rethink if it could be renamed something other than either mobility or movement down the line.
I mean, it's worth recognising there are layers upon layers here. So Rachel Reeves talks about mutual recognition of qualifications to help service providers, but actually, without freedom of movement, service providers are still going to be are going to find it very, very hard to practice across Europe anyway. So, I mean, all these things are a lot more complicated than they at first sound, and I think we just have to wait and see what they decide.
And just on the professional qualifications, it is worth bearing in mind it is enormously difficult to negotiate those sorts of deals. The EU took 10 years, or the architects took 10 years to do a deal of mutual recognition of qualifications in the framework of the EU-Canada deal. So this is not something that might be done as a quick win. And of course, they're talking about mutual recognition in the city, which was a very odd thing to be talking about, because lots of the posts, fund managers, trading, they don't have qualifications which require mutual recognition. So it was all very odd.
Yeah. Did you want to come back on the security point?
So just very briefly on the security point, of course, you're absolutely right that some of the things we've been talking about can't be seen in a vacuum. And in particular, if you were thinking about new joint activity between the UK and the EU on defence and security, that would have to be taken forward against the backdrop of the relationship between the EU and NATO, which is much better at the moment than it has been in the past, but still has certain tensions. And indeed, the work that's going on between different European countries and European countries in the US on some big defence projects, whether that's future fighter planes or tanks or new projects like air defence shields. So if we've given the impression that we've come up with something that's sort of super and simple and just no one had thought about it before, I wouldn't want to leave you with that false impression. This would be complicated, and it wouldn't take place in a vacuum. It would have to fit in with a wider debate about how the Europeans were thinking of working together better on that range of issues.
Maybe one point on the strategic autonomy. One of the countries more keen on strategic autonomy is France. Well, France is the EU country which has the most ambitious defense and military understanding with the UK. So I think that sort of replies to your concern. Yeah.
I think, am I right in saying that we're
at time, but you can have 5 minutes.
Okay, cool. Is there anyone... Okay, there's a couple of questions here. Let's take those, and then I apologise about your lunch.
Just very, very briefly, on the youth mobility, I think it's a great shame on the part of the UK that they were so negative about it. I think that's a desperate shame for kids. On security, I just wonder, are we in the situation in Ukraine because Putin saw weakness in the West at the time? And everything that we're talking about is in the future. And I'm not sure that we're in a position to wait that long. As a deterrent, shouldn't there be more discussion fairly quickly on security between the UK and EU? I would have thought that it was absolutely paramount at the moment.
Yeah. In the past, I get the impression that the EU has been very weak in terms of discussions and negotiations in global events around the world. It's more down to other countries that are actually had a greater role. Now, given what's happening in the EU now, is it going to be spending more time yet focused on internal events rather than the global events? And it's quite often individual countries rather than the EU as such that deals like defence agreements with the US rather than EU. And the effect of that on the UK and its relationship and discussions with other countries around the world, are we going to be hindered by the EU?
Right. Final roundup. Who wants to go first on either of those questions? I was looking in your direction rather than picking on you.
So I agree that the situation in Ukraine is very pressing and we should be doing more now. It has turbocharged the discussion around some of these issues. It's also the case that, as João said earlier, on the economic relationship with China is driving the debate on some of these issues. So there are real forces that are moving the debate forward. But to the gentleman who asked the second question, there is a risk that that momentum can get caught up and slowed down by the internal politics and other pressing issues that affect European countries. There's a lot of concern in Brussels at the moment about what might happen in France. There are some concerns about what might happen to the coalition government in Germany. That has always been the backdrop, and you have to try and, while being conscious of that, maintain priorities and take work forward. What I think we've been saying is that there's a potential coincidence between the arrival of a new government here that's looking to have a new kind of relationship with Europe, including potentially on security, and an awareness on the European side that they have to be more serious about some of these issues. Whether you manage to seize that opportunity or not depends on many factors.
I just wanted to say, while we've been talking obviously about the bigger challenges facing the EU and the UK, it is just worth remembering our local needs. The fact is, as our report shows very clearly, we are trading more in respect of goods with the EU than we have done for a number of years. That's partly because we're trading less with non-EU states, and therefore we have a vested interest in what regulation is coming out of the EU. As Julian said right at the beginning, there has been an extraordinary explosion of EU legislation in areas as important as AI and digital services. And we need absolutely to be on top of that because it will affect us directly because it has extraterritorial effect. So we need to be working hard to keep on top of all of this legislation, and we also need to be much better at thinking about ways in the way that the Norwegians do and others in trying to influence some of these ideas before they actually become legislative text.
Yeah, I mean, just to say that there is ongoing cooperation between the UK and the EU over Ukraine, and there has been from the day of the Russian invasion. So it is really extensive. There's also, I mean, I don't think it's very visible necessarily. It's quite difficult to manage. But there's also sort of developing division of labour between the between the EU and NATO. Something else, and I'm going to advertise a report that we're going to bring out next week, another UK Changing Europe report, is a sort of views from the neighbourhood. And there we look at 16 member states who've got bilateral relations with the UK. And in virtually every case, there is a security bilateral understanding, bilateral cooperation. It varies from place to place, but it is quite significant. So it might not be happening sort of directly at EU level, but it is happening on the ground across the continent.
Well, it's true that we are beginning a new cycle in Europe. It will take some months for things to stabilize. If you take the European level with the appointment of the new bosses of the main institutions, the new composition of the European Parliament, this will not stabilize before October, November. We have a few countries with difficult internal political situations. France was mentioned, Germany, a few issues, and other countries. So it's clear, as I said earlier, that having a new team in town here in November would be more aligned with our own calendar. But this being said, I'm positive and I'm relatively optimistic about what we can do in the coming months. I'm encouraged by what I hear from Labour in this particular case, and I would like to encourage them to be even more forthcoming in terms of new ideas. And I think I can say, as a EU citizen, that our capitals, and certainly Brussels, is looking forward to that dialogue in a positive way. So I think, just to leave you with some positive remark at the end, I think we are at the beginning of a new cycle. It will be extremely difficult for all the reasons that we mentioned, but certainly more positive and more optimistic than when I arrived here in 2020.
Well, that's an optimistic note on which to end, I suppose. Let me just thank my panel very, very much indeed. We now have an hour for lunch. Thank you.